Hey guys, welcome to another MTG Top 10 on the Neat Zone Magic channel. I'm Neat Zone and I post a new MTG Top 10 list every Friday. Earlier this morning, all of Shadows of Innistrad was spoiled, so this week and probably for the next several weeks, we'll be looking at topics related to Shadows over Innistrad. Speaking of Shadows over Innistrad, if you haven't entered my Shadows of Innistrad giveaway yet, you should, and an annotation should pop up right about now encouraging you to. Anyway, today we'll be looking at the top 10 cards I think we'll see play in constructed formats in Magic the Gathering. What I mean by this more specifically is cards that I think will appear at one time or another while Shadows of Innistrad is legal in Standard and have competitive success, or cards that I think we'll see play in Modern in the relatively near future. These are the two competitive formats, constructed formats that I play and know the most about, so I'll be sticking to those. So I'm sorry if you love Legacy, but I'm just don't really feel qualified to talk about Legacy a whole lot. So we will move, first of all, into honorable mentions, as always. We have two black honorable mentions from Shadows over Innistrad. The first of these is To the Slaughter. After Hero's Downfall rotated out of Standard, like decks that just wanted to run black, lost an easy way to kill Planeswalkers at instant speed. Ruinous Path is, of course, around in Standard, but the fact that it's a sorcery makes it a lot worse. And To the Slaughter isn't a sorcery. It does have the problem of being an edict effect, but there are enough control decks that run very few creatures or that run Planeswalkers as their win condition, especially after the good Planeswalkers, some of which we've seen printed now, but in the last few sets. And To the Slaughter lets you deal with those Planeswalkers at instant speed. This means, like, let's say Gideon comes into play, or Nissa, and they want to put their token into play. In response to that, you can just use To the Slaughter and deal with it. It also sometimes is going to be very good if you have Delirium, where it can hit two things for 3 mana. Obviously, though, it's not really a card you want to be mainboarding if aggro is a thing at all, which I think it will be. To the Slaughter will be really bad as a mainboard card, but I think it'll be a very strong sideboard card against control decks running very few creatures or Planeswalkers as win conditions. It also hits creatures like with hexproof like Dragonlord Ojutai, making it even better. The other honorable mention is also a black card, Dead Weight. It's sort of an unassuming common, but I think it'll see play in the new Standard format. Black almost never gets 1 mana removal spells, even though this is sorcery speed. I think it's pretty good. It kills creatures like Jace and other problem creatures, but obviously Jace is always worth mentioning. It also helps you get to Delirium, though, which is relevant, I think, in Standard. There's enough playable cards with Delirium, like To the Slaughter, for example. And it's hard to get an enchantment into your graveyard, but if you use this to kill, say, Jace, you'll get there pretty easily. So, all right, those are our honorable mentions. Let's go ahead and move on to the actual top 10 list. At number 10, I have Deathcap Cultivator. He isn't the most exciting of cards, and, it hurts from, makes you yearn for the days of Llanowar Elves and things like that. But in Standard right now, I think he'll be pretty good. Ramp decks are one of the best in Standard right now, and they need a new 2-mana mana dork to be in their deck after the loss of Rattleclaw Mystic, which rotates out when Shadows of Innistrad rotates in. And that's sort of the role he will serve. He'll let you cast your Explosive Vegetation on turn 3. I mean, there's Leaf Gilder still in Standard, so you still have your 8 mana dorks, which is something that deck likes to have. The Death Touch Clause, is going to be relevant every now and again. If that the Ramp deck in Standard can probably hit Delirium pretty easily because it throws a lot of cards in the graveyard to help it search out lands and things like that. And so I think Deathcap Cultivators will have Death Touch sometime in the deck, but I think most of the time it's not really going to matter. But it is kind of nice he has 2 power, so he can at least, beat down on the opponent if you need to do that. Right, so we'll now move on to number 9, which is Prader. I think he'll almost certainly see play in Standard. He's a 3-mana 3/2 that will every turn either damage your opponent or allow you to draw an extra card. Both of those things are things that red wants to do. I think this is a card that you're really only going to want in an aggressive red deck, because that's where he'll be at his best, a red burn deck, and or a Tarka red, for example. But mono red was sort of a thing there for a little while in Standard, and I think a guy like Prader can really bring that deck back. And he's, like I said, he's also good in a Tarka red. And on top of being a 3-mana 3/2 with that great ability, he also has Menace. And a red deck can often just burn at least one creature away and just swing with an unblockable Prader, and that's pretty great. I think this card is basically what any aggro deck running red wants to be doing on turn 3, especially one that tries to sort of burn out the opponent. And I think that'll be a thing. So I think Sin Prader's a very, very, very good red card. So on to number 8, where I have Sauron, Grim Nemesis. I think he'll see play mostly in Standard. He's a Planeswalker who can grant you card advantage with his first ability. And that card advantage is amazing because not only do you get to draw a card, you also have the potential to make your opponent lose life. And if you're playing a deck with Sauron, Grim Nemesis, you're likely some sort of control deck. And the chances of hitting something that costs 3 or more mana is pretty high. So draw a card, your opponent loses 3 life is pretty great. His second ability is also very relevant. It can act as a removal spell, it can act as a win condition, and it can just make it so your opponent can't kill you as quickly as they wanted to. He's in a worst case scenario, I think there will be times where you have to play him for 6 and kill something with his Planeswalker, his -X ability. But as a fail case, that's not too bad. The one area where he is sort of weak is he has kind of a bad ultimate. By the time you're playing Sauron Grim Nemesis, unless you're in some sort of life gain deck that could happen, I guess, you're not going to actually get that many Vampire Knight creature tokens with lifelink with his ability. You'll get several, probably like 10, but it's definitely not game breaking anyway, and it can be dealt with. I think his first 2 abilities are a lot better, but I can see him being in any control deck that happens to be running black and white. I think Sauron's going to be the kind of card that'll just help you win the game, since he can actually just win you the game by drawing you cards, which is just heinous. All right, so on to number 7, where we have Relentless Dead. This is a card that I think will be good in both Modern and Standard, but I have higher hopes, I think, about it in Standard. It's a problem for opponents to deal with in both formats, because he can just keep coming back as much as you want him to, as long as you have black mana up. And on top of that, if you didn't realize from looking at this card, you can actually use both of his abilities. You can pay 1 black to get him back in your hand, and you can pay X to return a zombie from your graveyard to the battlefield. Both of those are very, very strong effects, and that makes him very good. And on top of that, like Sin Prader, he has Menace, making him even better. And that just, I think, will make him very good in Standard. In Modern, I think he can also be good. I think some zombie deck of sorts will become better in Modern than it used to be, and because of Relentless Dead. But he's a little worse in a world where there's Path to Exile, as are a lot of the other zombies that are good in Modern, like Gravecrawler and things like that. So I think it's more likely he's good in Standard, but he could be good in Modern as well. He's that strong. So on to number 6, we have Traverse the Uvenwald. This is one I think will actually be at its best in Modern. I think that's the first of these cards I've said that about. Without Delirium, it's not the most amazing card, but it can help you fix your mana. But once it gets Delirium, something that's very easy to do in Modern, especially, it becomes a very, very powerful tutor. It can search out powerful lands like the Tron lands. It can also search out win-conditioned creatures and like Wormcoil Engine. I mean, if you can see where I'm going, I'm mostly thinking of this as a card for Tron decks in Modern. And the Tron decks fill their graveyards with a lot of different spells, including artifacts, lands, all sorts of stuff. So getting Delirium in a Tron deck isn't that difficult. And it's amazing because, as I said, if you say you're missing one piece of Tron, you can search up the piece that you need, assuming you have Delirium. And you can also, after you have all the pieces you need, you can search out your win condition, like Wormcoil Engine or whatever. I'd be surprised if this card doesn't find a home somewhere as powerful as it is. I think it's also going to be very good in Commander, incidentally, but that's probably something for another list. All right, on to number 5, where we have one of the cards that people seem to be the most excited about in general, which is Arlen Cord, and who transforms into Arlen, Embraced by the Moon. She's really, really good. A very strong planeswalker. She has the ability to protect herself by making a wolf token. The turn you play her. She also has the ability to just make one of your creatures scarier, but also have vigilance, meaning that creature can then also protect you. But when she makes the wolf token, she does transform. And when she transforms, she's pretty amazing as well. She can give all your creatures +1/+1 and trample, something that'll be at its best in a token deck of sorts, or any deck that goes wide. I could see her being played alongside Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, to pretty disgusting effectiveness. They both make tokens, they both pump tokens, so it's pretty amazing. And once she's flipped, you can also flip her back, transform her back, technically, by having her do 3 damage to a creature or player. So she turns into being able to have a lightning bolt. And her emblem's also pretty good, but as is usually the case, at least in Constructed, the emblem's rarely going to come up. And I think you're just more excited about sort of flipping her between making a wolf token and doing 3 damage. She does only have 3 loyalty, something that I think some people have overlooked in their excitement of the card. But the fact that she has 2 abilities before she transforms that protects her, that can protect her, makes her a lot stronger despite her only having 3 loyalty. So on to number 4, we have Epiphany at the Drown Yard. Basically, I think this card is too much like Fact or Fiction not to see play. I realize it's not as good as Fact or Fiction, but for Standard, this is a very, very powerful card draw spell. You can draw a lot of cards with Epiphany at the Drown Yard. Your opponent does get to sort of make the decision, but when you're looking at that many cards, you're probably even going to see duplicates of cards. I mean, it depends on how much X is, but even if you're not and you're paying like 4 and a blue, something like that, you get to look at your top 5. You make a couple piles and you figure out, what it is you want to do. You do have to strategize some in doing this, and if you're not familiar with playing with Fact or Fiction from back in the day, you have to think a lot about how you want to make your piles, and your opponent, people have this played against them, also have to think a lot about what they're doing. And so, yeah, Epiphany of the Drown Yard is a very strong card. It's probably not quite good enough for Modern, but I could see it there. Modern has Sphinx's Revelation, which is is better than Epiphany at the Drown Yard. But to bring up Tron again, I think a mono blue Tron deck could probably do some scary things with Epiphany at the Drown Yard, because they'll have so much mana. They can, cast it for 9 and, look at the top 9 cards of their library and make them in a couple piles. Both piles just happen to have a win condition in it that your opponent can't deal with. And that's pretty amazing. But I think this is another card that'll show up in any control deck in Modern that runs blue, at least as like a 1 or 2 of. All right, on to number 3, we have Anguished Unmaking. It's an extremely powerful removal spell, and most extremely powerful removal spells see play in Standard. We recently had Utter End, and it definitely saw play in Standard. And Anguished Unmaking also will see play in Standard. Utter End costed 1 more, and you didn't lose life, but I think I'd actually rather play Anguished Unmaking, which costs 3. It can deal with any problem permanent, so any sort of black-white deck's probably going to want at least a couple of these main board, maybe a couple sideboard. It can just deal with anything. It can kill indestructible creatures if they're running around. It can just deal with a lot of things. The losing 3 life is a relevant downside. I mean, there are going to be times in the late game where you really need a removal spell, and this is the one you draw, and you're at 4, so it's a little scary. But it's so strong that it's going to see play in Standard, regardless, of the life loss. And so I think Anguished Unmaking will be a very strong card in Standard. Number 2, we have another card that I think will be at its best in Modern, and that is Thing in the Ice / Awoken Horror. In Standard, I just don't think there's enough cheap cantrips and spells that you can make this guy work. I could maybe see it showing up in some of the Planeswalker-y control decks I mentioned, because it is pretty strong there. But those decks still aren't going to be able to flip it real quickly, and he's pretty easy to kill before he flips by multiple things in the format. But once he flips, he's ridiculous. He bounces all non-horror creatures, which can be relevant, and I'll explain how in a second, to their owner's hands, and I think that's very good. But I think he's better in Modern, where there's just cantrips everywhere, good counter spells everywhere, so you can basically just sit back with your Thing in the Ice. It's not a bad blocker, by the way, and counter things, either people trying to destroy your Thing in the Ice, countering, other problem spells your opponent plays, and Thing in the Ice just gets closer and closer to defrosting and taking over the game. It's also, I think it's going to be at its best in a Delver deck. The one downside about it in a Delver deck is it doesn't have the best synergy with Young Pyromancer, but, the Young Pyromancer is cheap enough that it might still be worth it, but I still think it's strong enough to at least warrant people testing it in Delver decks in Modern, because it's just that good. And it's important to note that it is good with Snapcaster Mage, even if it's not good with the Pyromancer, because you get another use out of your Snapcaster Mage's ability after the Awoken Horror bounces everything. And Spellskite, by the way, if you didn't know, was a horror, so that's also relevant. That's pretty much the only super playable horror in Modern right now, though. But being able to bounce your opponent's whole board and smash into them for 7 is pretty great, especially when a control deck only has to commit two mana to it in the early game, and then things, it just transforms without any sort of later mana investment because you're just doing things you were doing anyway. All right, so now we move to number 1, the card that I think is the most likely to see play in competitive constructed Magic, and that is Archangel Avacyn. If we don't see Avacyn show up in the new standard at some point, I'll be completely shocked. She seems to have been pushed incredibly hard, and it is a very good finisher for a control deck or a mid-range deck, a good curve topper for sort of a mid-range aggro deck. It's a 5-mana 4/4 who has flying and vigilance, so, Sarah Angel also has flash, by the way. On top of that, she gives your creatures indestructible until end of turn, including herself, by the way. So you can flash her in and just devastate an opponent's Alpha Strike, or flash her in and protect your board from mass removal. You can do all sorts of stuff with her. A lot of the time, I don't even think you're going to want to flip her, because in a control deck, having this dominating power in the sky who also has vigilance, so she can block too, is great. But there are definitely going to be matchups against aggro decks, low curve, very low curve aggro decks, where you really want to flip Avacyn, because she can just blow up your opponent's board. And the fact that she flips, and if your opponent can't do anything about her anyway, you actually swing. She does 3 damage to everything, including your opponent, and then swings for 6. So that's 9 damage in a turn, and that is pretty ridiculous. I mean, that's definitely something you should wait to do until your opponent's tapped out, so you can sort of maximize things. But that's just an amazing value from a card, because you can drop her down on turn 5, swing, and then a turn or so later, use her other ability and just kill your opponent. Between the 2 cards, you basically only have to swing 3 times with Avacyn, and she's dead. Your opponent's dead. So that's my list of what I think are the top 10 cards in Shadows over Innistrad that have potential for seeing play in Constructed. Let me know what you think of my list. Did I miss anything? Did I overrate something? Those things are all interesting to talk about, and discussion about it can sort of help all of us sort of get a grasp about how good these new cards really are. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.